and we've got Miles Munroe, who's live streaming from Portland, Oregon. You can see him there with the Westward stills in the background. Hey, Miles.
Hey,
hey. We've also got our very great friend of the brand here in Sydney, Alex Darlenberg. Thank you for joining us, Alex.
Miss it for the world.
Awesome. And really thank you everyone for coming online, and it's really an open chat about all things fun and whiskey. We're here to drink some whiskey, talk whiskey, and really we've got Miles, the Westward Whiskey lead distiller, on board. So it's really a great time to ask questions and really hear about Oregon and I suppose the craft distilling movement of America. So over to you, Miles.
Wonderful. Thanks, Margot. Hi, everyone. Welcome. And yeah, we'll keep this, I'll stay on track, but we'll keep this sort of a loose format. So ask questions at any point that you'd like. Well, I'll try to answer them in real time and keep everybody going. But I was actually just mentioning before we got started going live here that, I've been attending some of these online whiskey tasting webinars. And we've got a couple whiskey bars here in town that are hosting a bunch, but something that's kind of, I don't know, I guess maybe rubbed me the wrong way about those is sometimes we're about half an hour to 45 minutes into the tasting and there hasn't been any tasting yet. So if you haven't cracked your bottle open yet, I hope you have, but if you haven't, please do. Pour yourself a little Westward and let's get to know it. Because that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
So I hope
lunchtime drams for us here in Australia.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's 8 p.m. yesterday here.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an introduction to myself, kind of how I found my way here to Westward as the head distiller. A bit of background there, and then we'll kind of dive into the brand itself. But so I've been in Portland about 13 years. I came from a service industry background and just fell in love with whiskey, single malt specifically, and wanting to learn as much as I could about the process before getting into production. I realized that, great single malt is great beer first. So I decided I'd become a brewer, and that's actually what brought me to Portland, was the craft brewing scene here. There's an amazing brewers scene here in town. We've got something like 82 or maybe 84 breweries here just in Portland, just within the city. It's definitely a mecca of craft brewing in the country here in the United States. I think our first brewery was opened in 1984. Which is Bridgeport Brewing, where actually that was the first place that I brewed outside of brewing school. Great old brewery. They were making IPAs here in the States in the early 80s when most people were still, just happy with fizzy yellow lager. So we've got a great history here of brewing. That's actually also where my mother's from. I grew up on the East Coast of the States, but I'd come out here to visit often to see family, see where she'd grown up, and just was kind of a no-brainer at that point when I wanted to get into beer and whiskey. So found my way out here. I actually went to brewing school. I studied the science and engineering of brewing at the American Brewers Guild, and then brewed here for about 5 years professionally in town before starting to look around at all the different distilleries that were popping up here. Portland's got a great craft distilling scene as well. We've got something, I think, around maybe 20 or 22 craft distilleries here in the city also. It's just a big maker culture that's really inspired by a lot of what everyone else is doing, whether it's food or spirits, wine as well. There's just a great creative atmosphere here for sure. And so, to be someone who discovered my passion for single malt and pursued beer first, I was pretty excited to meet Christian Krogstad, CK, as we call him here. He's our founder. He started the distillery in 2004. And, we crossed paths when I was looking around at some of these distilleries here in town, and discovered Christian, who actually was brewing in Portland all throughout the 90s, even actually owned his own brewery at one point, but eventually, got into making single malt whiskey. I felt like I had found my people. This is where I needed to be. And so strong-armed him, forced him to hire me. And that was just a little over 7 years ago. And when I came across the distillery, we were in our original location, which was a tiny, sort of maybe 3,000 square foot distillery, tanks everywhere. We had maybe 30 barrels of whiskey that we were aging at that point. And so I was brought on to make a lot more, to really up production. And so it took a couple years. I was the only production distiller, and we actually only had one still to make our double pot distilled whiskey. But eventually we moved into a new space, which actually you see behind me here. I'm still at the distillery. That's actually our massive pot still there. I call that Julius. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie Twins with Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Our other pot still, which is up on stilts behind me, is a much smaller pot still. And so that's Julius and Vincent, we call. Actually, maybe I'll take you guys back there in a minute once we get into the process portion of this talk. But
hey, Miles, Crafty Fields jumped in to say, "G'day, how you doing, Miles?" And he also said that it's great to see distillers that put so much emphasis on the brewing side, so important to flavor generation. What do you think it was about Portland that started the craft boom?
That's a great question. Great comment too. Thanks, Crafty Field. I mean, yeah, that is our ultimate emphasis on, making our spirit, is the fermentation process, is the beer aspect of it. And, in Portland, I mean, so in the States, and I think it's probably very similar in Australia as well, we had this wine renaissance. We had a lot of smaller producers start to make a lot of wine and gain a lot of attention on the world stage throughout the 70s and into the 80s. And then once that industry bloomed, craft brewing was right behind that. And so you started to see people, much more interested in just alternatives to, one certain style or one type of beer, just like they were with wine. And so it seems like it's a natural progression to then go from beer then into whiskey and craft spirits, and just start to really branch out and see what else is out there. And I mean, we had a prohibition, I think around the same time as Australia did. Ours was from 1920 to about 1933. When that ended, there was quite a huge distilling scene in the States. We had a lot of people emigrate from Scotland and Ireland, and a lot of people brought that distilling tradition to the States. Unfortunately, during Prohibition, a lot of those small, true craft distilleries were shut down, and really we were only left with maybe 3 or 4 distilleries that were massive once we came out of Prohibition. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it didn't really leave us with too many options. And that really kind of took us through the rest of the 20th century here with really very limited choice as far as what was being produced for, whiskey distilleries here in this country. And so, to get back to the emphasis that we put on brewing, it's, I'm an ex-brewer. Our founder is, all of our distillers are also ex-brewers as well. It just seems like a natural progression to kind of go from the brewing field into the distilling field. Actually, I was just giving a talk the other day, and someone asked if it was a prerequisite that you are a professional brewer before you work for us to make Westward. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily true, but we're also in a part of the country. We're in the Pacific Northwest. We're in the Northwest corner, where we don't have a traditional heritage that goes too far back for distilling. It's not like we're in Kentucky and there's generations of, distilling heritage there. And so there's this huge swath of people that have all this distilling background. But, brewers, they come and see our facility and see what we're doing and see that, we're making a single malt. It's all malted barley. We're essentially making, beer first that we then double pot distill into whiskey. So it's great that we have such a huge brewing force here, because people walk in, see our production facility, and they understand almost half of our process right away. So yeah, it's definitely something that we put a lot of emphasis on. It's in Portland, we're actually in the what we call the Willamette Valley. We're between two mountain ranges. And so we get a lot of rain up here. We actually get, I think, 40% or so more rain than the national average just here in the valley. And so what that also produces is a great growing region. It's just, you know, it's great for barley especially, but there's so much great fruit and so many other grain crops that are grown here. We also have somewhat of a volcanic soil here. We're actually on the Ring of Fire that goes throughout the Pacific. There's supposed to be some epic, I don't know, earthquake or volcanic explosion that's just going to level this whole area someday. But for now, we've got this great volcanic soil. We've got this really great temperate rainforest zone here. And so we're just rich in a lot of great raw materials, you know, even for beer. The Yakima Valley is just north of Portland, and it's where the majority of the hops are grown here in the US. So yeah, that really, really inspires a lot of experimentation and creativity when it comes to crafting beer and crafting spirits as well. Do we have any more questions for now?
There is. This is from Crafty again, have you played around using pot ale in the mash water? It was a conversation that you two had at Oak Barrel when you were last visiting.
Oh, very cool. All right. Yeah, we've got some returning guests. That's fantastic. Yeah, that was just a little over a year ago I was there, right?
Yeah.
Sometime in March, mid-March.
Yeah. Last year.
I mean, I should be there now. We had planned on me actually of processes and methods from Scotland. And when you're talking about mashing, you talk about waters, right? And your rinsing of the grain. What I can say about our process is that we don't have a series of waters. We actually have just one continuous rinse, what brewers call a sparge. So it's actually just one continuous rinse through the grain bed for about 2 hours per batch. Because we take our pot ale and actually recycle, we actually hang on to the heat, the thermal energy of the pot ale. It actually goes into a bigger tank, a bigger system, to where I don't actually think it'd be very easy for us to reuse that pot ale. I'll get into that a bit later when we're covering the process in a little more detail.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, again, more of that emphasis on the beer aspect of it. I think the reason that we do like one continuous sparge rather than a lot of waters is, you know, our fermentation process is a very slow, low temp fermentation. We're, you know, to get back to kind of our raw materials for a second, you know, we're very picky about our grain. We use 2-row malted barley that's all grown here in the Pacific Northwest. It's malted just a few miles away across the river in Vancouver, Washington. And it's a blend of 3 different malts, 3 different varieties of barley. And yeah, we're in constant contact with our maltster, with our supplier, about the degree of quality of that malt. You know, we're getting it into our silo here, and we're milling it into our mash tun ourselves. You know, it truly is a grain to glass spirit. And so the specifications that we give for the malted barley is that it's actually what we call a high modified base malt. So when you're talking about beer, you know, that's your base malt is the building blocks of your beer, aside from your specialty grains. And you know, there's in the process of malting, a certain amount of heating and drying, which you could call kilning, which actually kind of caramelizes the malt a little bit, gives it this Maillard reaction. And so you get a bit more of these toasty biscuit notes from the malt. And so we actually request that our maltster kiln just a little longer and at a little higher temperature to coax some more of that out. The one drawback from that is that you could actually get some astringency from that process. And so rather than several waters, we like one continuous rinse at a certain temperature, so we don't pull too much of the proteinaceous matter and too much astringency out of that mash. Is, I guess, a very long answer to that question. If everybody's still with me.
Yeah, so we're getting some great questions. I think you probably covered off one from James Finnegan, which was really, hi Miles, do you get much of your malt locally grown in the valley, or do you need to import? So maybe if there's more on that subject, and then we've got another one really about barrel types.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, when you're talking about single malt, there's always more to talk about with grain. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm of the opinion that single malt whiskey, that, you know, malted barley whiskey by far makes the most delicious, flavor dynamic, complex whiskey that can be made. And yeah, a lot of that comes from the malt. I mean, when we talk about Westward, we talk a lot about provenance. We talk about, you know, a bit about terroir, but more of just, you know, where our ingredients come from, how they're treated once we get them. And so, yeah, we're very, very interested in malt. Yeah, it's all grown around this area. Great Western Malting is our primary maltster. We also work with a family-owned maltster grower in Central Oregon. They're called Mecca Grade. It's a father and son team that run the farm. They're 5th and 6th generation farmers on this same plot of land. And Seth, the son, is a huge into beer and spirits. And so he's actually built himself a sort of microbrewery in one of their barns there on the farm. And he developed this malting process from some old German conveyor equipment. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but he's actually mimicked floor malting with this machine. And so they're growing everything there. They grow both spring and winter barley. But yeah, we use certain types of his grains, certain types of his barleys to great success in a lot of our stuff. I've actually been meaning to bug him. I think, you know, once all this is kind of past us, I'd really like to do a project where we actually start to collect a lot of wild yeast that is present on his barley that's growing on his farm. We've actually got we've got a yeast lab here in town in Portland called Imperial, and I'd love it if we could grab samples and actually grow up a culture of that wild yeast and then ferment our mash with that and start making whiskey with cultivated wild Oregon yeast. So yeah, we talk malt a lot.
So Miles, just to, I suppose, to take people through like a mini distillery tour, which I think for me, I like to sort of understand what the steps in the process are and, you know, what's unique to Westward and how that affects, you know, really what's inside the bottle and you know, the really robust spirit that we're all drinking today. Do you mind kind of stepping us through what that process looks like and timeframes and, you know, the fun facts that people love, you know, everyone loves to know?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we decided to pursue, you know, craft distilling and single malt, you know, we call Westward an American single malt. That's a new category. That's a new term here. You know, there's such a great single malt distilling tradition throughout the world. What we wanted to do, and we wanted to make sure that we did when creating this new category and this new spirit in that category, is to not really emulate anything else that was out there. We needed to make it our own. We thought, you know, there's plenty of good single malts out there that I love, but I would never want to replicate that. It's already out there and it's delicious, so why would we do that? With Westward, we thought, well, this is going to be an American single malt. So what does that mean? What does the American palate expect? Or you know, what does that deliver to consumers as far as what they might expect from that? There's a train going by, so I'm gonna take us into the distillery real quick.
Okay,
show you guys the stills.
So how often does the train go by? Because it's so loud at the distillery, right?
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. You want to say it so often you don't notice, but we notice.
Yeah.
So, and so you're right. We had the question of, well, so what is an American single malt to us, right? And so that is why we have such a robust spirit that is Westward. One of those factors was fermentation and the type of yeast that we would use. We actually use an ale yeast. We use a pale ale yeast strain, one that's so ubiquitous in the United States in the craft brewing world that yeast labs refer to it as 001. It is just the very definition of craft American pale ale flavor characteristics. And that's something that we thought would be just a wonderful addition to this American single malt. So when we use this ale yeast, we're getting these really great Deschutes Pale Ale comes to mind there, Mirror Pond, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which basically defined the category of American Pale Ale. We're coaxing a lot of those same flavors out of our fermentation. So big tropical fruits, honey notes, really nice sort of green apple, grassy notes. All this comes from that fermentation process. Our fermentation, we call it a slow and low temp fermentation. It's a fermentation that is basically done at beer temperatures, which is much lower than a typical whiskey fermentation. It also takes about 5 to 6 days. It's a very, very slow, long process. And the reason we do that is, we liken it to minimalist cooking. It's taking excellent raw ingredients, treating them as well as you can, and letting that shine through in the final product.
Quick question, Miles. I know that I've been asked it quite a few times. What sort of temperature do you consider low temperature fermentation?
So we ferment at 74 degrees Fahrenheit. So what would that be, like 22?
22, 23, yeah.
22, 23 degrees C. Yeah, and our fermentation vessels are actually, well, let's just walk over to them. Our fermentation vessels are jacketed, and they have a coolant that runs around through the fermentation tanks to keep it at that temperature. So this is a very contained fermentation. This isn't an open air fermentation where, wild yeast and certain bacteria can get into the wash and add characteristics. This is very sterile beer fermentation. That's, again, we want to only create those certain flavors that are going to come from that fermentation. And the reason for that is, again, our minimalist approach to distilling. Everything that we're creating, all these different flavors that we're creating during fermentation are going to come through in our distilling process, because we have these very basic low reflux stills that are actually pretty unforgiving to a lot of wash if it isn't made the right way. These are the fermenters here. This is the brew house here. So yeah, that's a 30 barrel brew house. That's a beer barrel, which is 31 gallons. And so that can make, 30 barrels of beer per brew, per turn. And we're brewing on that 3 times a day to fill one of these fermenters up, which is a 100 barrel fermenter. One of those fermentation tanks is going to fit its contents directly into Julius, our big still, our giant pot still over here, which I'm walking back over to. Yeah, Scotty, you did just hear a train.
And if anyone wasn't feeling dizzy before, now we've followed you through the distillery. We're all kind of moving.
So I'm gonna come up on the distilling stack, and then we can stay still for a second here. Did you see what I did there? Yeah.
I like it.
Stay still at the stills. All right.
Rocking.
So this is our 3,000 gallon pot still, about 11,000 liters. This was made for us custom down in Kentucky by Van Dome Copper and Brass Works. pretty famous, well-renowned still maker here in the States. They're family-owned, family-run. They make a lot of custom stills for people all over the world. What's custom about ours is that for the size of the pot, it's actually a very squat column. And that's intentional, of course. Again, we run a very low reflux distillation. And what that means is, reflux in distilling terms is basically refining the spirit characteristics. The more reflux you have, the cleaner spirit you have. And reflux is, we're talking about distillation, which is boiling out alcohol, right? So as a vapor, that alcohol travels up the column here, and it eventually actually gets so cool at the top of the column that it'll actually condense back into a liquid and drop back down. That's reflux. That's refinement. That's actually making a bit of a cleaner spirit. But if you refine your spirit too much and it's too clean, then you've removed a lot of the good characteristics as well. I often say during a tour, something like a mash that you're going to make vodka out of, that tasted like something at first that had a lot of characteristic to it, but it's distilled to neutrality. That's all done through distillation. That's all done through a lot of reflux. We've got just, so much involvement in the malting of our grain, the selection of our yeast, the whole process of producing our mash, that we want all of those characteristics to come through the distillation. So we've got a very squat column made entirely of copper that was hand hammered, hand formed down in Louisville, Kentucky by Van Dome. You can see it's got the onion, the bell is at the very bottom, again, to just discourage a lot of reflux. And then our lye pipe, our line arm that comes from the top of the column across to the condenser, it's got a very short run and it's actually angled down. So again, discouraging too much reflux, not a whole lot of copper contact, because we really want to preserve a lot of those really great, robust, fruit forward flavors that are going to come through at the end of the spirit. So that's our first distillation. If anybody's curious, we run both of our stills off steam. We have internal steam coils in the big still, and then steam jackets on our smaller 700-gallon still. That first run, we'll take our 8 to 9% beer wash, and out of those 3,000 gallons or 11,000 liters, we'll get about 700 gallons or about 2,100 liters of what we call low wines. That's our first run spirits. That's about 35% or about 70 proof. It's a bit crude. We've basically just distilled all the alcohol out and a lot of the flavor characteristics to come over. And this time for our second run, which is the high wines or new make run in our smaller still. And that's where we're making some pretty tight cuts. This is when we run our high wines, it's all done by sensory. We don't have certain cut points by temperature or proof or time in the run. Every single run, every batch distillation on our pot still is done by one of us through sensory, through taste, through smell, and making those cuts every single time, every single day. And so, we'll have a new distiller trained for probably about 6 months to 8 months, depending on their palate, I guess. And before they're actually allowed to be up here on their own and make those cuts. Does there have any more questions yet? I know I'm kind of just steamrolling through the process here.
A question from David Taylor. Do you experiment with other barrel types, i.e. Shiraz, etc.?
Oh, great question. Well, yeah, let's, so I'll talk a bit about aging and barrels, but I'll answer your question first. We do. Again, we're just so provenance driven, and there's so many inspiring makers here in Portland and all around Oregon. But yeah, of course, we're gonna, get curious about what other people are doing in barrels, and we're gonna see what those barrels can do for us. We've got a wine cooperage down just a little ways south of here in wine country. We've had them make some barrels for us out of what we call Northwest oak. It's actually Gariana oak. It's native to the Pacific Northwest. It is a white oak. And then, yeah, we've got a lot of friends making wine, and we've been interested in their barrels too. I mean, you know, I'm a fan of a sherry or a port finish on a single malt, but that really wouldn't have made sense for us and really aligned with our values and kind of what we're trying to do here, because we're just so, again, provenance driven and locally focused that, so, you know, also we have these world-class winemakers right here in our backyard, just down the way. So you may know this, but the Willamette Valley here in Oregon is pretty famous for its Pinot Noir. It grows really well here. We actually have very similar conditions in our wine country to Burgundy. So a lot of great Chardonnay, a lot of great Pinot Noir is grown here. So yeah, it was really only a matter of time before we started to finish Westward in some Pinot Noir barrels, which we have done. We've experimented with a few others and had great results as well. We've got a great Tempranillo finish. Yeah, we've been kind of slowly releasing those here and there as we go. But you know, to get back to our primary aging, we're using all new charred white American oak. That's pretty much across the board here in the States. That's sort of the accepted method. That's actually in our code of federal regulations to basically define whiskey. You know, bourbon, straight whiskey, rye whiskey, all those terms, if you want to put them on your label here in the States, it says that you have to put your new make spirit into brand new charred, never before filled white American oak casks. And, you know, for us, again, wanting to make a spirit that is an American single malt and speaks again to the American palate, we thought we would stick with brand new barrels. So we source our barrels from a couple different places. Here in the States, you'll find new barrels either near the whiskey or near the forests. And that's either sort of central states or down around Kentucky, where you find most of the distilleries. And so we get all new American oak from them. We use a low char barrel, about a level 2 char. If anyone's unfamiliar with the char levels, char 1 is allowing the barrel to burn for about 15 seconds. Char 2 is 30 seconds, char 3 is 35, and char 4 is actually 55 full seconds, almost a minute of allowing that wood to burn. That's actually, most bourbon producers use that level 4 char, what we call an alligator char. That's because the inside of that barrel just is reminiscent of alligator skin. And those kind of barrels, especially charred that heavily, are very assertive. I mean, all that new wood, all that new oak has a lot of flavor to give. And then a lot of that char will actually also act a lot as charcoal and filter a lot of the flavors out. And so it depends on the style of whiskey that you want to make, but given that we're, you know, this single malt producer wanting a lot of the fermentation flavors to really come through, we go for a lower char, just want a lower barrel influence overall on the spirits. Really let that malt shine through.
Miles, are there any barrels around in the distillery that we can take a bit of a look at? And
yeah, for sure. I'm gonna make you guys dizzy again now.
I love it.
Back around this way. There's Julius.
And interestingly, just going back on, you know, some of the other barrel types, we'll touch on some new product launches a little bit later for the Australian market, which will be fun to talk about.
Definitely. Yeah, these are actually a few of the older barrels we have here. I think, yeah, this one here is actually the first barrel of whiskey I ever made for Westward. And we're hanging on to that one for a couple more years, see what goes on there. And then, yeah, this is actually a barrel that we call the Heritage Barrel. So talking a bit about barrel finishes, I know we'll get back to this a bit later, but, you know, our connection to the brewing industry, if I haven't made that abundantly clear, is very strong. We've still got a lot of friends, you know, ex-co-workers, people that are still, you know, very much involved in the brewing industry that we continue to work with. We actually invite brewers back to the distillery and we'll recreate one of their beers, whether it be a stout or a red ale or something that we've all determined will actually make a pretty good whiskey as well, and we'll replicate their beer. We'll actually make a clone of their beer on our system and turn it into whiskey. So one of the first things we did with a brewery, though, was another brewery that I used to work for, Migration Brewing here. They make an amazing stout every holiday season, and it's pretty popular for a lot of craft brewers to age their stouts in ex-whiskey barrels, and so that's another adventure that we struck up about 5-6 years ago, and we'll touch on that at the very end. But to get back to our process, I'd like to talk a bit about the climate here again. When you're talking about a wood aged spirit, especially single malt, and especially one that isn't going to be heavily influenced by a barrel, climate makes a very, very big impact on that spirit itself. I mentioned before how much rain we get here in the Pacific Northwest. What that actually does, in hotter climates, you see a lot more evaporation at a higher rate. You see alcohol loss at a higher rate. I remember actually last year I was at Archie Rose, and I think Dave said they see something like a 20 or 22% loss in volume the first year or two, and I just was so sad. It's just such a huge loss of whiskey. It's crazy. So here it's a much more temperate climate. We're basically a temperate rainforest. We only see about 6% loss in volume our first year, and maybe about 3% or so after that. We have long, sort of cool, wet winters, and then we have these warm but dry summers. Never gets too hot, and so we actually see water loss quicker than alcohol loss. So we actually see a rise in proof over time. So we see our spirit proof rise in barrel over the years, which absolutely affects, how the spirit's going to age in that barrel and what it extracts from the barrel and how it interacts with that barrel as well.
Crafty's got a really good question with this. Do your variations of spirit run length time vary in summer versus winter?
Summer versus winter, absolutely. Yeah, most definitely. So they say that aging will actually halt in barrel at about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Can't do Celsius conversion off my top of my head, but in somewhere like Kentucky, where they have these incredibly hot summers that are very humid, and then these extremely cold winters where it's quite a bit of snow, those spirits will actually age much faster. I think similar to somewhere like Archie Rose, where they're just, experience much hotter temperatures and a quicker evaporation rates. Whereas here, again, it's pretty moderate, it's pretty temperate. So we're never getting down below that sort of aging temperature where things halt. It never really gets below that, but we're never actually getting too hot either. And so for us, we think it's pretty perfect for aging westward. It really makes a really just delicious, flavorful spirit. We actually, like I pointed out, some of those barrels back there were some I made about 7 years ago. We start to see such a high rise in proof in those that I actually start to put some water in those and proof that down, so it doesn't extract too much from the barrel, so that it doesn't get too woody or astringent. But yeah, I mean, temperature, humidity, those are things that I monitor with sensors in the barrel house, just to make sure that they're on point, because those absolutely affect aging time, oxidation. There's a lot of what we call esterification, where a lot of these esters can oxidize. They just basically develop while the spirit is aging, and airflow is very, very important to that. Does anyone finish their...
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to ask, do you mind kind of talking us through the barrel house and some of the innovative things that we've done, or what it looks like, and I suppose and why that's important?
Tell us all about Jenny.
Jenny.
Everyone's got a name, right?
So our barrel house is named Jenny. She's on Jennifer Street. That's where she got her name. It's a 28,000 square foot warehouse. isn't standalone, and it isn't a typical what we call rick house here in the States. So a lot of aging warehouses that you'll see here in the States are just glorified sheds. You know, they're tin roof, clapboard siding, a shallow, you know, mud basement or foundation. A lot of older ones are actually brick as well, with a lot of windows that they open and close during the seasons. But, you know, that is something that's very specific to bourbon. They want a lot of interaction with the extreme hot and the extreme cold, because that drives the spirit in and out of the barrel over and over and over. And, you know, again, with bourbon, they rely on the barrel itself to provide quite a bit of the characteristics of the spirit, whereas we're actively trying to avoid that. So, you know, Jenny isn't climate controlled. It's ambient temp, but it is a closed building. And so, you know, we just sort of let it age naturally that way without, exposing it to the elements too harshly. The other thing that we do, because again, we're in this sort of danger zone in the ring of fire, we can really only arrange our barrels to a certain height and in a certain way. And so when we expanded to this new distillery here about 4.5 years ago, we decided to move from racked aging or side aging, which is traditional aging, to upright or palletized aging. That's something that a lot of producers in whiskey have been moving toward for probably the last 10 years, if not a bit longer. You know, no one really sees any kind of difference in aging time or flavor drift or anything like that, but you're actually tipping the barrel up on its head, palletizing it, and you can stack them that way. And so it's a lot safer for us to move around. You know, barrels on racks are pretty dodgy. They can roll off, they get a little squirrely. You know, most injuries for distillers are with barrels. And so you want them to be as secure as they possibly can be. The other thing is, again, we can only stack to a certain height. And so it just made sense for us to move to this way of just working safer, stacking better. The one drawback I saw in stacking, though, with this upright aging is airflow. I just mentioned that, you know, airflow is very, very important for aging, for oxidation, for coaxing a lot of these great characteristics out of the spirit over time. And when you have a lot of barrels stacked together and piled up, then you reduce airflow significantly. And so I developed this system, these kind of 4x4x4 cubes with a bit of space between each row. And then instead of shifting the barrels around the warehouse, it is a big warehouse, and we would see some temperature changes throughout different parts of the warehouse. But instead of constantly shifting, you know, 225,000 gallons of whiskey constantly, I decided to just move the air around them instead. And so I've got some ceiling fans that are on timers. We've got some fans sort of placed around the barrel house in certain ways, and they turn off and on throughout the day and help move that air around and shift temperature to make sure that we get an overall sort of homogeneous aging zone for all of that whiskey. Has anybody finished their bottle yet? No?
Right now, within the last 38 minutes. We'll do our best. We did have one other very interesting question, I think.
Okay.
Why do you think that the Australian market is so open to American craft spirits and vice versa?
That is a great question. Absolutely. And, you know, it wasn't, so outside of the States, Australia was our first market that we opened outside of our own country. And to us, that was such an easy decision to make. It just, I think, you know, the appreciation there for spirits, for trying something new, for being adventurous and checking out different spirits, the interest in the makers themselves, in what people are actually doing, the innovation, and us being so beer focused, you know, also seeing the appreciation for craft beer in Australia as well. It seemed like a natural place to go. Absolutely. What I didn't realize until actually going there, you know, last year, was that, you know, here in the States, bourbon is king. It is, when everyone says whiskey, they mean bourbon. I realized, though, traveling outside of the States, that anytime someone says whiskey, they generally mean single malt or even blended malt whiskey. And that is, I think, the world over. And so it was just a welcome surprise to, you know, there's a bit of a hurdle here, again, with everyone and everything just so bourbon centric. And, you know, I can sit and explain to someone the whole process of making my single malt, you know, malted barley whiskey. And they say, great, I'd love to try your bourbon. It just doesn't quite land here all the time. It's really, again, people are just brought up on bourbon. It's what we know here in the States. And so it was so refreshing. It was so wonderful to get to Australia and talk about craft single malt, and everyone just immediately understood and was immediately on board. And it's just fantastic. Really, really great. And same for, you know, coming this way as well. You know, Starward is doing really well in the States. Actually got to co-present with one of their distillers when I was in Melbourne last year for Whiskey and Dreams. And got a tour of their facility and was just blown away at how similar theirs was to ours. I mean, not even just their process, but their approach, their philosophies, everything was just in line. And so, yeah, I mean, Australian spirits are doing really well in the States as well. I think just, you know, in those areas where craft spirits are appreciated and there's an educated consumer that can grasp onto those ideals, definitely. Let's see. More.
We have another question from James Finnegan. How long does a barrel last? Do you refill them once they've aged?
Great. Yeah, that kind of brings us to the end of the whole process discussion. Yeah, these are new barrels, and they, again, you know, through our standards of identity, have to be new barrels every time we put new make into it. So we're basically bound to using barrels just one time. We have started here, Westward, we've helped start the American Single Malt Commission, and we lobby along with a couple other craft spirits alliances to actually get the term American Single Malt as a recognized category. You know, we can put that on our label now, but as far as, you know, from a consumer standpoint, that doesn't really mean a whole lot because it isn't actually technically defined by our government agency that would do that. And one of those stipulations that we have put in under the article of American Single Malt Whiskey is that producers would be able to actually fill their barrels more than once, and that you could actually put your new make spirit into a used barrel if you want. If you'd like to stick with, you know, brand new barrels, absolutely. But if you want to use, you know, first fill, second fill, third fill, by all means, go for it. So yeah, we're pretty much bound though for now to using brand new barrels. And so for, I don't know, maybe a century or so now, you know, most of our barrels in the States actually go to Scotland. They're not bound to that law, to that restriction. They can fill barrels 2 times, 3, 4 if they think they're still gonna actually yield some good results. So yeah, we're just filling our barrels once for our core spirit, for Westward, our flagship whiskey, which yeah is something that we'd like to remedy for sure, definitely. So Westward is designed, we've engineered it to be a whiskey that's on the younger side. We don't have an age statement on the label. That's deliberate. For us, we feel that it's less about age and more about maturity. You know, when I say we design it to be a younger whiskey, that means that, again, that minimalist approach, you know, where we're creating a lot of flavor up front carefully through our fermentation and preserving that through our low reflux distillation. We want that brightness. We want that robust flavor. We want that really great sweet spice brightness to come through in the whiskey. And so we don't actually want to put too much age on the spirit. It's designed to be a younger whiskey. It's not necessarily better or worse that, you know, a whiskey is a certain age or not. Again, it's less age, it's more maturity. It's whether that spirit itself is actually ready, you know, and has those certain aspects that you want to drink from. So we age Westward 3 to 5 years. Typically, I've got some that, you know, obviously we just saw is a bit older. We're just curious to see what happens with those. But yeah, Westward is Westward is bright. Westward is something that should be drank young. We want it to be something that really jumps out of the glass and has just full malt flavor, not a great of those fermentation notes, which a lot of those can be lost through age. And so, about 4 to 5 years seems sort of the zone that we find is best for Westward. When that's all done, I'm also the head blender, so I will, I manage our barrel house, and I'll take samples periodically back to my blending team here. That's myself, Christian, our founder, Andrew Tice, who is our director of operations, and our resident Aussie, Jordan Felix, who is our distillery ambassador, whiskey expert. Those are the 4 of us make up the blending team. So I'll bring our samples back to the distillery, and we'll sit and taste through our different samples and come up with what we call our mingle. We don't really refer to it as a blend because it's really only maybe 8 or 10 barrels at a time. It's just such a small amount of whiskey that we feel like even the term small batch is actually too big. But we still want to blend the whiskey. There's something to be said for single barrels. Single barrels of whiskey have their own idiosyncrasies and have their own personalities. But blending barrels of whiskey together makes such a depth of flavor, such a complexity that you really can't get from just a single barrel. And so we'll mingle about 8 to 10 barrels together, which that's something that blending is its own art. It's definitely another sort of extension of the craft of distilling aside from production. We can sometimes knock out a mingle in about 15-20 minutes. Everything kind of comes together and it's great. And sometimes though we're about 2 or 3 hours into the mingle session and kind of drunk and kind of confused as to why we haven't found the magic yet. But that's the art of blending. Sometimes there's certain characteristics that are actually either masked or hidden when you start to blend barrels together, and there are others that are jumped forward that are really kind of come out. I approach blending sort of from like a perfume maker's standpoint. I don't know if anyone's ever seen either like a coffee blender's guide or a perfume maker's guide. Is this sort of pyramid, right, where you've got your top notes, your sort of middle palette, and then your base, right? And you sort of want to build your base first and put your top notes there at the very top of it. So we're blending, like I said, about 8 to 10 barrels together at a time once we've reached maturity, and then into the bottle it goes. But each blend, we strive for consistency, but we feel that each time we mingle and put a bottling out, that it's going to be just ever so slightly different. That's not something we really advertise. We don't put batch numbers on our bottles or anything like that. But we really want it to be a very dynamic whiskey. We feel like that's an exciting part of craft. We feel like that's something that really separates out the craft world from a more established brand or certain big brands, is that we're trying different things. We aren't experimenting for experimenting's sake, but we want it to be a very dynamic spirit. We want people to really feel engaged with it.
And Miles, from a tasting perspective, what I always find so fascinating is when we get to drink Westward, which is why we're also here, is the fun part is that everyone does have a different palate. And for me, I'm really drawn to, this is in my non-technical speak, but I'm really drawn to a lot of sweet food. So I really find lots of vanillas and brown sugars and fruity notes. But from more your expert palate perspective, can you talk us through a bit of a tasting?
Yes, absolutely. I love it. I've done the tasting my way. We're 45, 50 minutes in, and now we're going to talk tasting. We've been drinking the whole time. It's fantastic. So I'm sure a lot of you have been to tastings. This probably isn't your first rodeo. Maybe it is. But Tasting spirits, obviously a bit different than something like wine, right? Where there's just a lot more alcohol, it's a higher proof. And so, the approach is a bit different. Something that is the same though is probably wanting the appropriate glassware. And so, we have these Glencairns here, this sort of tulip-shaped glass that's good for whiskey. I mean, it's not entirely essential, but what's great about the glass is, as it kind of tapers to the top, it can actually focus a lot of those aromatics that will be emanating off the whiskey itself. But you don't want to get too close. I usually like to kind of get to the very top of the glass near the rim. It's good to alternate between your nostrils. One's usually kind of doing a little better than the other. I like to part my mouth out just slightly. Alternate between the nostrils there. It really gives a good sense of the aromatics. And I mean, the aromatics are a majority of the, the flavor that you can perceive. When we say flavor, we mean both taste and smell combined to make flavor, right? So, when sitting down to do a tasting or the sensory here, we'll usually pour samples about 5 minutes ahead of time. That also allows the spirit to open up and let some of that volatile alcohol actually come off, so it won't block the sensory, the actual smell that you want to get from the whiskey. But yeah, once it's sat and opened up, if we're talking about like a higher proof, if we're talking about a cask strength, which we here in the States, we offer single barrel at cask strength, you'll probably want to throw just a little bit of water in that. It helps open that up, breaks up those oils, and brings a lot more of those aromatics out. So, going in for a taste after you've smelled, just a quick kind of knock back into your palate. I'll roll it around in the mouth for a little while so it can hit every point of my palate. Swallow and then actually breathe out through your nose. It brings it's what's called retronasal. It brings a lot more of those aromatics back out, and you get a full experience of that whiskey.
When you're blending, talk us through the flavor profiles that you're getting through on the palate. Sure.
Well, actually, Margot, I mean, you brought up some notes that I definitely get. Something that kind of blew my mind touring Australia last year with Westward was, I think it's just being a little too close to it here. You can't really always see the big picture, but, a lot of people had said that Pacific Northwest single malt actually had a regional style and actually had regional flavor characteristics, which, I mean, in hindsight, completely makes sense. We're hyper local. We're using all this grain that comes from our own area. We're aging right here on site, and so it's provenance driven. So of course that would happen. But yeah, something that a lot of people noted, especially about Westward, was it's sort of lush brown sugar chocolate finish. That is something that we get a lot of. I think it's in combination not only with, again, our highly modified malt, which is toasted a bit more. You get more of those chocolate, roasty kind of biscuit notes, a lot more of that caramelization, sort of that kind of, bottom of the baked chocolate chip cookie. But then also from the new barrel as well. When you talk about charring a barrel, it's a bit different than toasting a barrel like you would with wine. When you're actually charring a barrel, you're lighting it on fire and you're breaking down what's called hemicellulose. And that's basically the structure of the oak. But what happens is when that hemicellulose breaks down, it releases wood sugars. And wood sugars are great vanilla notes, really nice chocolate notes, coconuts, baking spice, vanillins. Yeah, absolutely. And so, that's going to come through as well. And I get a lot of nice sort of fresh cut grass, sometimes a little citrus, some stone fruit really comes through. On the palate, yeah, some more of that lushness, that brown sugar, a little spice, again, some stone fruits, a bit of dried fruits. There's a lot of nuttiness, I feel, that kind of comes through in the finish. What really always strikes me about Westward is its mid palate. I think it's got a great nose and a really amazing finish, but that mid palate, there's just so much structure there. There's so much complexity going on there. And I think that's really what makes Westward stand out as a single malt.
And just a question for Alex. What was it as a venue manager that made Westward stand out for you? Is it a hand sell over the bar?
Well, Margot, brought me Westward. I think it was in November 2008. We sat down in the booths at Mjolnir. I am a huge bourbon girl, being a country girl, but majority of my travel and my back bar that I work with is single malt. So I have a love for the American style whiskey and then also the single malts that are coming out through around the world. When I first tasted it, it was almost like a combination of those two worlds put together, and absolutely delicious. So I think, one, it's very easy for me to sell because I do actually just drink this at home. But my team well and truly got behind it. We actually incorporated it into our short rib in the restaurant. So it is a Westward Whiskey glazed short rib. Absolutely stunning. So it goes with those big, meaty, bold flavors. So really not a hard sell in the restaurant. We actually have a couple that come and have it with the short rib at the same time. It's one of those spirits that goes so well in cocktails, food. I like to match it with a creamy blue. I know that might seem a bit weird, but that's my favorite at home. It's such a great product because in Australia, as you mentioned before, the demographic, we're quite open to both the American bourbon whiskey style and the single malt. So one of my favorite things to do is if someone says, oh no, I don't drink American whiskey, my favorite thing is to slide them a glass of this. Or if someone says, oh, I only drink bourbon, slide them a glass of this. It's a perfect world to just confuse people in that way as well. It's definitely stands up in both categories.
I can't wait to come to Molyneux when you reopen and taste that short rib. I'm hungry.
Right. I love that. Yeah, you absolutely nailed that. I mean, it's a hybrid of styles. You know, we're making it very much, you know, in a traditional Scotch style, a bit more beer focused, but then, yeah, we're aging it like a bourbon. We're putting into new unused charred oak barrels. So yeah, you're getting the best of both worlds there. It is where those two meet for sure.
I also don't think the Australian market was quite used to the use of new American oak on single malt. So there is a couple in the market, quite a few, but I don't think Australia was hugely exposed to it in quite a way until Westward hit the shores.
Absolutely.
We've got a question saying, you mentioned the US consumers generally think bourbon when they hear whiskey. Do you think that it's holding you back in your domestic market? And how does it compare with international markets? How does it compare with international markets that are more single malt aware?
Yes. I think it's again, I was just so blown away by the immediate acceptance and great response in Australia to Westward. Whereas here, again, yeah, I think there's a bit of a hurdle, you know, when it comes to some kind of whiskey that isn't bourbon. But, you know, I mean, Americans are pretty adventurous too. And it really just, it just takes a taste. You know, Alex, you were talking about, you know, if someone says they don't normally drink this or they don't normally like that, I'm certain that, you know, we'll win them over with Westward. Absolutely. But yeah, you know, there's a certain challenge here to, making something that isn't bourbon. But I think just like the craft brewing worlds, you know, it just takes a little more time and a bit more of an educated consumer who wants to know. And I think we have that base here. And that's, you know, we find a lot of our drinkers for Westward are people that are actually very interested in craft beer here in the States. They want to try something different. You know, they understand that, you know, you don't have to just say, well, why make anything else other than bourbon? Well, you know, why drink anything else other than Budweiser? There's just a myriad of flavors out there in the world that you can try. And, you know, whiskey, of course, is, you know, it's just grain, water, yeast, and wood. But there is so many variables that you can switch out. There's so many different things that you can do with that wood, that you can do with that grain, that you can do with a different type of ale, or excuse me, different type of yeast strain, a different type of distilling method. You know, there's just an endless world for that. And there's just so much more great flavor that can be created when you try new things.
Yeah. Now we've got some more great questions. One was, where does the nuttiness come from? Ferment, mash bill, wood, etc.
I think a lot of the nuttiness will come from the grain itself. Again, we like a bit of a more kilned base malt, a bit more of a kilned barley, and that really brings a lot of that nuttiness through. And again, you know, with our very minimalist approach to distilling, you know, to try our new make spirit, to try our unaged, what we call our white dog, has so much of that nuttiness, doughiness, really great hazelnut flavor. Yeah, that's all coming from the malt.
Oh,
it's really
amazing in a Bloody Mary, the new make.
What?
Your
the new make.
Amazing in a Bloody Mary.
Really?
Yeah.
Kidding. Okay. Well, I've got some Bloody Mary mix right here. I'm going to try it. That sounds amazing. Wow. But yeah, so, you know, we are trying our utmost throughout the entire process to bring these flavors forward, to preserve a lot of these raw material flavors. We never want to mask or hide or otherwise stifle a lot of these great flavors. Every step of the way is meant to produce or continue a lot more of these wonderful flavors. And yeah, that nuttiness is a testament to that. I mean, you were tasting the grain, you were tasting the malted barley right there. That's the nuttiness, absolutely. I just spilled that grain everywhere. It's great.
So we've got some more questions. Do you use a machine to get a consistent flavor between the batches of Flagship Westward?
A machine?
Yeah.
Yes, I am the machine.
Oh dear.
So, you know, as I mentioned before up at the stills, everything we do is by sensory. It's a batch process, so it's a big challenge. You know, having a craft is doing something as best you can that day, the next day trying to replicate it, and then see if you can't make it better, and see if you can't do that process a little better. That to me is the definition of craft, of having a craft, of whatever that craft may be. And so, no, there aren't really much in the way of machines or measurements or automated processes. This is done by humans every single time. And in that way, every single day, we try to just make it better.
All right, I have some cool questions because I actually had the privilege of heading over to Portland and spending some time in the distillery as well as the warehouse at Westward. I would love you to talk about some of the cask programs that you do over there. I know that it's a long shot from seeing some of it over here in Australia, but I know in the distillery you can pick up little experiments or cool stuff that you've been doing that I know that I get a lot of questions while we have the American single malt in the market in Australia. What do we got? What else is over there and what's coming?
Love it. Absolutely. Yes. So yeah, I mean, we're makers. We're very experimental. We want to try new things. And like I said earlier in the talk, you know, we want to know what winemakers are up to. We want to know what brewers are doing. So yeah, we've experimented with a bunch of different wine finishes, you know, from winemakers that are here in Oregon. Again, that Pinot Noir is a finish that, you know, something that we've released here in the States. We actually did a little Pinot Noir finish with the Whisky Club in Australia, actually last year.
We're very lucky to receive that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, you know, so, and then we've also, you know, done some beer finishes, and that's something that is actually headed your way. I've got a bottle right here. This is Westward, this is Oregon Stout Cask Finish.
Yes, we're very lucky to have a couple of these around. Margot's even got herself one.
Well, just so everyone knows, it's only just landed, got off the ship here. So you will see our market very, very soon, which is super exciting.
I do know that when we were at Whisky and Dreams with Miles and Westward, the stout cask was one of the biggest hits of Whisky and Dreams. Everyone absolutely loved it in those special masterclasses you were doing. So I know there's a lot of people very excited for what's to come.
It's
Yes.
delicious.
And that's so great. That's so great. This was born out of a partnership with breweries. I mentioned Migration earlier, who I used to work for. They took one of my recently emptied Westward casks and aged their Belgian chocolate imperial stout in that cask for about 6 months. Racked out the beer, packaged it. It was delicious. Long story short, they basically sent the barrel back to me, and I put a 4-year Westward in that barrel for another year. So that was a 5-year aged product, and that was how Oregon Stout Cask Finish was born. Thinking about the characteristics, the flavor profile of stout beer with its roastiness, its chocolate notes, its nuttiness. I mean, that's just an absolutely perfect flavor match for Westward. It just made complete sense. And so that extra year, in a barrel that's actually now been used twice, it's on its third use, you get a bit less of that baking spice from the barrel itself, kind of a bit of a smoother dram. And you get those nice roasty chocolatey notes. I wanted to be careful when making the whiskey that it wasn't, a stout flavored Westward, but a stout finish Westward. And so, there are certain, subtleties that you can pick up, and it's just a really delicious whiskey.
And if I'm correct, it got so popular that you reached out to a hell of a lot more breweries within Portland, that you're now exchanging barrels with some other breweries. Is that right? That's
right. Yeah, I mean, just that one barrel, sold out in our tasting room in a couple of weeks, and we realized we had to start making a lot more of that. And so, I basically started a barrel loaner program where I'll actually give my whiskey barrels to breweries if they promise to put stout in them, and just send them back to me. So we're at something like 42 breweries now. We have this barrel exchange program with out to the coast, up in the mountains, all across. Which is very exciting. We love to partner with all these breweries, but it also quickly became somewhat of a logistical nightmare to try to track all these barrels that are going to all these different breweries. So last year we actually partnered with Deschutes, which I believe has distribution in Australia, right? Deschutes beer.
Deschutes
it's huge. Actually, Australia's Deschutes' second largest market.
That's amazing. Really? Yeah. They're one of the bigger craft producers here in Oregon. They've also been around since the mid 80s. Their Obsidian Stout is a craft staple. I mean, it's really just inspired a whole world of stout beers. And so we actually partnered with them last year, and I sent them, I think, 90 of my whiskey barrels, which they're aging their Abyss, which is their really, really amazing imperial stout that they release once a year. So we've partnered with a bigger brewery there to try and produce more stout cask finish. So that's in part why it's made it to your shores.
Exciting. So we're hoping to get that to you guys in oak barrel very, very soon, just in a matter of weeks. So by the time it gets through customs and, lots of back-end logistics, it won't be long until everyone will be able to taste this great Oregon stout cask finish in Australia.
It's super exciting. I can't wait to have it.
Soon enough.
Exactly. And then in terms of other innovation that we have going on in the distillery, we launched as a special product last year, the Pinot Noir cask here. It went extremely well. It was absolutely delicious. I think really the starting point is, our American single malt. We're launching the stout cask. And all I would say is the best is yet to come. You know, there's so many new things that are being, you know, Miles has got cooking away in the background. So I'm working with some different people to bring lots of different innovations to our market, because I think, you know, what's really exciting is that Aussies love to try new expressions. So that's the great thing about Australia. We love craft beer. We love our single malt whiskey, and we're lucky enough that Miles and the team over there are really innovative and think of some great, you know, great ways of bringing out new expressions, and that's the exciting thing about Westward.
Absolutely. Again, there's so many great makers here. It's such a great growing region. You know, we could experiment with finishes and grain bills and, you know, fermentation techniques ad nauseum, and we do. And that's something that we love to do. Just, you know, tweak something here and there and see what results we get. Something that's been very exciting with the, you know, Pinot finish as well as the stout finish is just, you know, the type of characteristics I can get from different producers, you know, that will give us different results from either, you know, someone's oatmeal stout or a particular type of, you know, Pinot Noir maker, and, you know, whether they make more of sort of a lighter style or more of a, you know, richer sort of deep style. Yeah, we will continue to try new things with this spirit, absolutely, and we'll keep sending them your way.
We've got another question. Are you thinking of doing any rosewood or hickory smoked barrel expressions?
Well, you know, something that I think we decided to not explore, given that we're, you know, I guess pioneers and pushing at the forefront of this American style of single malt, was we wanted to stay away from peats. We wanted to stay away from a smoky aspect of the whiskey, again, just to, I suppose, differentiate ourselves from Scotch and from those styles. We feel that there's actually enough confusion when it comes to American single malt in the States that, yeah, so any kind of, you know, smokiness or peat, we decided that really wasn't going to enter into the equation with Westward. That doesn't mean we don't want to try it. We're certainly open to the idea, but yeah, we thought we'd leave the peat and the smoke to the Scots for now. Yeah. I mean, you know, we do. You know, we've in the upper north central part of the country in Minnesota, we've got huge peat bogs. But that's just, again, you know, wanting to carve out our own niche and define ourselves and our own style of whiskey. We decided that that wasn't going to be part of it.
There's a comment here saying every time I end up back on the screen, there's another bottle of Westward that appears.
It does.
And that's I was very lucky enough, as I said before, to head over to Portland, and I think I bought out the distillery in all their special expressions. So I'm very lucky to have some of the distillery only releases, plus my own bottle that I got to marry or blend up myself.
Very cool.
But if anyone ever gets the chance to be over to Portland, it's an amazing experience to head over there. There's such a great family culture at Westward, and Portland's just fucking badass. So
yeah, and we welcome people to go visit our distillery all the time. We love it. So it's you know, that's part of the craftsmanship of Oregon, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, we're all very welcoming. We're all very open. You know, we want people to see what we're doing. We're all very excited about what we're doing, and we're all excited about what each other is up to. You know, we're constantly checking in on each other. You know, we've actually got just across the street here from the distillery down the way is Smith Tea. They're tea makers, and I will every once in a while literally roll some barrels across the railroad tracks to them and they'll age their tea in my whiskey barrels. Yeah, and I mean, here, you know, we've got this big tasting room. That's actually where I am, with these big windows looking into the distillery. When, you know, we're allowed to, we'll have tours again on a daily basis. We don't have any secrets here at the distillery. We want everyone to come in and see every step of our process, because we're very proud of it. And, you know,
I can confirm that, because I think everyone in the Australian market or whiskey scene knows how many questions I ask. There were no questions that were off limits while I was there, and I think I asked every single one I could think of.
You did. We even put you to work for a little while.
I did. I was very lucky to work a day with Liam and Steve.
Steve, yes.
It was amazing. He loves jerky, so
he sure does.
Send my love to them, please.
I will, absolutely. Yes, 100% will. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, aside from, you know, just the openness here, like I said, we want people to, you know, be an educated consumer. I think that drives interest, that drives business, that drives so much behind what we're doing. Is people who are actually interested in more, who want to see more, and actually, you know, literally put a face to the name and actually see who's behind the brand, what we're doing, and, you know, see that there's really just, you know, 6 of us distillers every day making this product from start to finish. It's just us. How are we doing on time? How am I doing?
Awesome. I think we're almost time to round up, unless there's any further questions. I know that it's a bit later in Portland than it is over in Australia. It's now, see, we're having lunchtime drams, and you're heading into your evening, right? Friday night.
Yeah, I'm getting into some evening drinks. Yeah.
9:20 at night there.
It is in the past.
And you're still at the distillery. What a legend.
I love this place.
I know.
Well, yeah, hopefully, yeah, we can introduce the stout cask finish soon enough. You can see what a bit of dark beer influence does to the whiskey, and how it really just flavor matches so well to the really nice chocolatey notes, and how it sort of dries the whiskey out just enough. It's really pretty tasty. I did bring a couple of bottles with me. We had just released it here in Oregon only when I came to Australia last year, so I brought a few bottles, and you know, yeah, took it to Whiskey and Dreams, took it to Oak Barrel as well, and you know, brought it out for some tastings, and I got a great response from most everyone about it. And then, of course, you know, a bit of annoyance that, you know, I brought this delicious thing that no one could actually buy. So I promised everyone that it would be available this year. So we've made good on that promise, and hopefully we can all sit down and try it soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd just like to thank Scott and Joe from Oak Barrel. Alex, thank you for coming along today, spending your afternoon with us.
Thank you for letting me sit in.
Sorry, you go.
Thank you for letting me sit in. It's always exciting to chat with Westward, especially Miles, and I can't wait to have some more of the stout cask in the country.
Absolutely. And Miles, thank you for coming on board on your Friday evening. It's much appreciated, lots of fun. But mostly I'd love to thank everyone who really participated in today. We're thrilled that you love our Westward American single malt whiskey and your support for Oak Barrel. And we can't wait for you guys to taste our Oregon stout cask finish as well.
Yes, thanks for joining us, everyone. Joe, Scotty, thank you for hosting us. I'll draw on the wall the next time I'm there, I guess.
Awesome. And yeah, we can't wait to get you down here in person, Miles. But until then, with the whole border thing, we'll enjoy seeing you on the screen.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you, everyone. Have a great Saturday afternoon. Enjoy your Westward and enjoy Mother's Days for all.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.